Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Rosie, for the introduction and also for the quick catch-up on what the Valuing Nature Network has been up to. I haven't really been involved in Valuing Nature since its inception, actually, so it's great to see the breadth of activities and the diversity of activities from a programme that is really funded from relatively small amounts of research council funding. It seems to be achieving a huge amount. So, my talk this afternoon, Rosie asked me to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm not exactly going to do because I don't really have a lot to say about the Sustainable Development Goals, except that I have been thinking about them in various ways. And so what I'm doing in this talk is trying to blend some of the thinking around the SDGs with some of our other thinking around ecosystem services and natural capital. And that's what I'll try to do. It's quite a general high-level talk, but I hope it'll be of interest in just bringing together some of these concepts that are developing traction in various science and policy areas. So I'm going to touch on 6 different topics, actually, which I'll link together. So first of all, I want to just start with a bit of an introduction to the way in which we frame nature conservation. It's where many of us come from a nature conservation background or from a wild nature perspective. And I think it's interesting and useful to think about how that framing has evolved into the kind of thing that we're talking about here. Then I'll go into a little bit more detail on how it bears the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services and the SDGs represent nature and its services to people. I'll talk a bit about biodiversity and ecosystem services, and then a couple of examples of thinking about resilience from a more ecological perspective, and then I'll end with some examples of making investments in nature, which comes from some of the work I've done as a member of the Natural Capital Committee. So just to start with this framing of conservation, I'm sure many of us have been thinking about nature conservation for many years, and it is a topic that's has some very deeply held views by many people, that we want to conserve the natural environment, that we really care about wild nature, species and habitats and so on. And there's been something of a pattern of change over the past 30, 40 years as the way in which conservationists have thought about their goals and their objectives has shifted to sort of meet prevailing societal demands. And I just want to run through this history. Some of you may have heard me talk about this before, so I'll take it quite quickly. But I think it's a useful backdrop to thinking about valuing nature. So I want to just start in the 1960s. At this time, nature conservation was of the form that I call nature for itself. This was kind of pure nature conservation, saving species and habitats for their own sake, for their intrinsic value, if you like. So the idea here is we're just interested in saving wild species. And the way to do that is through protected areas and wilderness, and much of the science was around designing protected areas. Should you have one large one or several small ones? And mostly it's about beautiful species in beautiful places that tend to have no people in them. It's a wilderness thing that the ideal is people aren't there. There's just beautiful nature. And that was a great way to do conservation for a long time. It turned out, and it became obvious fairly quickly, that the protected areas framing was not going to be enough to cope with the relentless pressures that there were on many species and habitats. And by the time that I was a postdoc and thinking about nature conservation, we've moved into what I call the second phase, which is nature despite people. So this is trying to protect wild species and habitats in the face of persistent and strong threatening pressures that are caused by human population growth and development. So a lot of the work that I did early on about extinction risk assessment and PVA and minimum population size, were to try and address that problem, how to save nature in the face of threats. And of course, it brought much greater attention to thinking about what the threats were: habitat loss, invasive species, over-harvesting, pollution, pathogens, and so on. And now you see conservation move into a different thing where you're primarily dealing with the threats: deforestation, the ivory trade, bushmeat hunting, a whole series of rather negative messages about conservation. And by the end of the 1990s, or somewhere around there, it was clear that wasn't working either, that just trying to hold back the threats was not enough. And the conservation framing then took a flip over from focusing primarily on species and habitats and into thinking far more about ecosystems, and also into making it far more about the benefits to people. And this third phase, that I call Nature for People, is the ecosystem services phase. So we're thinking about not how do people protect nature, but what does nature do for people? What are these irreplaceable services that we get from ecosystems that people need to secure in order that they're there for the future? And so this is the backdrop to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that Rosie talked about. And apart from moving the focus from species to ecosystem, we also see for the first time the services word, but also talking about economics and valuation and benefits and capital and all the things that many conservationists find more uncomfortable framings. Water tends to have a big place in ecosystem services, and there's a strong focus on the less biological, the more abiotic parts of ecosystems compared to what there was in the conservation one. And now we have people in these landscapes. In fact, they're human-dominated landscapes. Pollinators, the poster child of the ecosystem services paradigm, but a whole series of new ways of thinking about nature and trying to conceptualize ecosystem services, which is a very complicated thing. And for many people, I think the ecosystem services paradigm is still dominant. I introduce a fourth one, which I think is an interestingly nuanced version of ecosystem services that tries to move away from some of the things that are uncomfortable around ecosystem services, but try to make it less utilitarian, bring back some of the intrinsic values of nature. And this fourth framing that I call people and nature. And this one, a lot of it comes out of the kind of new resilience thinking. I think it's very relevant to all the Anthropocene because it's more forward-looking. And it's about how people and nature are going to survive in concert, in the dynamic interrelationship, in the future, in the face of all kinds of pressures and changes. So the people and nature theme is not about what nature does for people. It's also about how do people help nature so that nature helps people. It's about this dynamic interrelationship between the two. It's more forward-looking, it's more about resilience and vulnerability, but it has a big theme around social science. It links very strongly into societally held values, cultural, local knowledge systems and so on. And it has a big basis in systems thinking. So now there are still human-dominated landscapes, but now they look nice, they're pretty. There are some of these kind of semi-engineered systems, so where this is a dune system that's been engineered to help the vegetation to grow to support the dune system. And then there are happy people who sometimes get a bit carried away about how easy it is to be in concert with nature. So those are the four framings, and there are several important things about them. I've presented them as if they happen one after the other, and they do appear one after the other. But actually, when you get to today, which is kind of at the bottom of this figure, all four of them still exist together. There are people who work very strongly within each of those for paradigms. And sometimes that's the reason that we struggle to articulate a clear vision around what we mean by valuing nature, because I think sometimes we're at cross purposes. The other thing to notice about this is that as we move from this traditional nature for itself framing, which was primarily the domain of wildlife biologists and ecologists, and was underpinned primarily by natural science, and down here into the people and nature and nature for people, you bring in a whole series of new disciplines that are necessary to achieve that way of thinking about nature. So now we need to have economics, social science, political science, a whole set of disciplines that were not there in the beginning. And that's caused us over the years to have to learn a whole new set of skills, and it's why the Valuing Nature Network is so important, because it's growing that interdisciplinary thinking that makes it possible. So some of the really tricky issues that I'm sure the network is dealing with have to do with some fundamental differences between these framings. So one of them, for example, is what is the goal of your nature management program? So if you're in a nature for itself framing, it's actually quite easy to say what the goal is. It's mostly to preserve some identifiable set of species or to conserve some habitat that you can point at and you know what it should look like. So we have kind of clear measures of success, but they're very biological. By the time you move down into the people and nature framing, it's far harder to say what that goal is. It's something about a resilient, co-produced, co-managed system of people and nature. And you end up in a bit of a conundrum of words of trying to explain what the goal is. I'm not saying that those aren't more valid goals, they're just much harder to articulate. Prioritizing actions, what should we do first? Should we be securing a small community from flooding by intervening in the landscape and building some dams or dikes or something, even though it's going to destroy habitat? Or should, that's a priority action to protect people. Or should we be waiting 20 years for a floodplain to recover so that nature's own systems can take place? So it also leads to these conflicts about what to do first. And one of the most fundamental debates in this space is about the role of valuation. Should we put a price on things? Is it a price or is it a value? What's the role of monetization? What's the role of economic valuation? And perhaps most fundamentally, what is it that's being valued and by whom? And that differs all the way through the sequence of framings. So that third one I think is particularly interesting, and I'm not going to talk about that one at all, because I'm sure other people here could do more about it than I could. But I am going to, and I just don't have time to do it, but I am going to try and focus on the top two and think a bit about some of these measures of success and prioritizations. So in doing that, I'm going to use the people and nature framing. I think it's useful, it's inclusive, it can include much of the nature for itself framing, as I'll show you. It certainly includes much of the nature for people, and I think it's a more productive way that we can move forward. And I'm going to do that by just at the beginning saying I want to reframe nature. And these two knots that I put here, not a passive human population growth, we see an awful lot, particularly from other disciplines, of nature just being a victim. It's kind of like climate change is going to destroy nature in the same way as an iceberg melts when you heat it up. And it kind of ignores the fact that nature has a lot of coping, resilience and adaptive capacities of its own. So I want us to reframe nature not as a passive victim. The second one is, apparently there are some people in our government who think nature is an obstacle to economic growth and development, and I want us to move away from that. So instead, we're going to reframe nature as a necessary underpinning for vibrant and thriving human societies. That's what we've all grown up with. It's where people evolved with nature and along with nature, and we want to preserve that for the future. So that's the frame I'm going to adopt. And what I'm going to do now is go in and think about how that is represented in these two bigger UN policy frameworks that are relevant in this area, IPBES and the SDGs. So I won't spend long on IPBES. I expect many of you know about this, but if you look at the conceptual framework of IPBES, I think it has that framing very firmly in it. It's a slightly complicated framework, but basically here's nature, which can be spoken about in these different knowledge systems, different epistemologies, the Western science one, and various others that come from different cultural backgrounds. So the Western science one is in green, biodiversity and ecosystems, that feeds through to ecosystem goods and services, that feeds through to human well-being. So there you see this underpinning role of nature. And the important thing is that all of that is governed by people. These institutions, governments and the indirect drivers are influencing nature, they're influencing nature's benefits to people, and so they're affecting that flow of benefits around the system. And that operates across scales of space, and it changes over time. So I think the IPBES framework represents this idea that nature is a necessary underpinning of human well-being. There's a lot of debate about exactly how you link the nature and nature services and indeed the governance drivers in the middle. So let me talk a bit more now about the Sustainable Development Goals. So this was a set of 17 goals for the future of the world that were are set to be delivered by 2030. So the goals run till 2030. There are 17 of them. There are actually 169 targets within them, which I advise you not to even look at, because they are a really strange mixture of things. I think the goals make some sense. When you start getting it to target level, there's a set of very strange, mutually incompatible things that underpin them. They were negotiated over a 2-year period from 2013 to 2015, and then were signed up by the UN General Assembly just about 2 years ago now. Now there's a really interesting backdrop to the SDGs. A lot of the new framing in them, the way that they differ from the Millennium Development Goals, arose out of this high-level panel report, which worked quite hard between about 2012 and 2013. It was co-chaired by David Cameron, actually. And there are a set of very nice underpinning principles that the high-level panel produced. So one of them is leave no one behind. So unlike the Millennium Development Goals, which were basically about reducing poverty, this was about ending poverty for everyone, everywhere, forever. So it's a universal set of goals. There's a nice statement in the high-level panel report. Put sustainable development at the core, integrate the social, economic and environmental dimensions of sustainability. Now, if any of you remember the earlier framings of sustainable development, the Brundtland report, there were 3 pillars. The environment, economics and society were 3 separate pillars, and they all had to be sustained. What this report says is you've got to integrate those. All of those have to be brought together into a single mission to support the continued well-being of humanity. There's one about economics for jobs and growth. There's one about peace and accountable institutions. There's a nice one at the end that I read this morning and thought how nice it was. A new spirit of solidarity, cooperation and mutual accountability must underpin the post-2015 agenda, based on a common understanding of our shared humanity, based on mutual respect and mutual benefit. How great is that? What happened since 2015 that's got lost? Anyway, it was all good then. So the thing that was different about the SDGs from the Millennium Development Goals is underpinned by some of those things. The universality, they apply everywhere. They're not just for developing countries and the poorest people. They apply to every country, every sector, cities, businesses, schools. Everyone is encouraged to operate within them. They're supposed to be integrated. It's recognised they're part of an integrated system. You can't just go out and say, I'm going to achieve the education goal and not worry about the rest. And they are transformational. Achieving them will make a very big change to the way people live their lives. So these are the 17, if you don't know what they are. It's a very strange number. It makes it very difficult to draw charts, obviously. And they go through from no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, education, gender equality, sanitation, a whole set of things about well-being. And then the final ones have these environmental goals: climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice and strong institutions, and then a partnership to achieve the global goals. So they cover a very wide range of things. And it's extremely complicated to think about how all of those are going to be delivered simultaneously, everywhere, for everyone, in an integrated system. And if any of you read the current literature, it's becoming awash with papers showing how at odds various goals are with each other. How you achieve one, it's going to be impossible to achieve the others, and so on. And I think we're all struggling with how to implement them. So I thought I'd show you a framing of the Sustainable Development Goals that came out of a paper that Jeff Wage and colleagues presented in 2015. So this was very shortly after the goals were established. And Jeff put together a team of people, including a lot of public policy people and some health and education. He himself is a food and agriculture expert, just to think about how you would govern a set of goals of this sort. And they came up with this rather interesting way of thinking about them, which I think suits value in nature. So you start off with, there's a set of goals here that you can think of as the well-being goals. They're the ones that are most similar to the Millennium Development Goals. So they're things like no poverty, good health, quality education, gender equality, equality generally in society, peace, justice, access to peace and justice and fair institutions. Now these are things that are the normal business of national governments, and mostly they're compatible with each other. As you provide better education, you get better health. As you have less poverty, you have better health and you can deliver better education. They're mutually compatible goals that are taken generally to be the responsible business of government or local government. They're part of what we pay our taxes for. And on the whole, governments have been pretty good at delivering them over recent years. Now, if you think about what you need to achieve those, they're underpinned by a set of the SDGs that in this paper are called the infrastructure goals. So these are systems that you need to support that. So a food system to support the hunger goal. You need energy, you need water, you need sustainable consumption and production, you need safe and secure environments, decent work and economic benefits, sanitation. These are the systems, the infrastructure that you need to deliver those other benefits. And the interesting thing about these is that they are often actually in the private sector. Many of them are international. For example, particularly the food and the energy system are managed largely by independent large corporates. And these goals are often in conflict with each other. Food versus energy versus water, for example, is the whole nexus problem. And they're often in conflict with those well-being goals in the middle. So that's, I think, an interesting articulation of the problem. And then there's a third set of goals that are called the natural environment, the climate goal, life underwater, and life on land. So these are the global commons. This is the sustaining the global environment. Nobody really manages these. Nation states try to. We have some big international conventions, but most of them are pretty ineffective. We've had some success with the Paris Climate Agreement, but it's nothing like the degree of governance experience that you have within nation states. So the natural environment tends to get abused by those infrastructure goals, so we're trying to remove all sorts of things from it, but it's necessary to sustain that well-being in the middle. And I think thinking about it, particularly with the natural environment goals as underpinning for all the others, gives us a way to frame a lot of the research and practice around the Value in Nature programme. So I'm now going to, if you think about that framing and then put that into the way that we tend to think about natural capital or ecosystem services supporting benefits for people. This is a picture from the Natural Capitals Committee's How to Do It manual, How to Do It workbook, which was published earlier this year. So this will be familiar to you. Here's the environment, natural capital, whatever we want to call it. I don't want to get into a debate about terminology and semantics. I'm just going to loosely interchange natural capital with ecosystems in this talk. But here's a set of things in the environment that produce a set of services that ultimately underpin benefits that people require. So these are the things, as in the SDGs: food, energy, clean air, clean water, recreation, hazard protection, wildlife conservation, equitable climate. That's just a set of possible benefits that might be achieved. And that's the framing that I'm going to use through this talk. The point I want to emphasise at the moment is that when we do it this way around, you start here with thinking about the required set of benefits and then work backwards to see what are the natural capital assets or what are the environmental conditions that are going to be able to support that benefit. A lot of the early work we did in ecosystem services, we'd start here and work out what the potential services were, and you end up with lots of these service maps of overlays of lots and lots of potential services. But I think a more functional way to think about it is to start on the right-hand side and work backwards. So then how does biodiversity fit in here? What's the link between biodiversity and ecosystem services? And this can be very confusing because in some people's mind they're exactly the same thing. Biodiversity is an ecosystem service, and for some people biodiversity is an underpinning of ecosystem services. And I think the answer is that biodiversity is a very confusing word because it's all over the place in this framing. There's biodiversity that is part of the environment, that is nature itself, that is a natural capital asset, that is the species and communities that form functional complexes within ecosystems. There's biodiversity that we care about because it's a benefit. People care about certain sorts of species and habitats and we want to conserve them, and so it's a benefit as well. And it's also a service sometimes. So pollination, which is a service, is underpinned by what people think of as biodiversity. And so I'm not going to, the biodiversity word can be confusing which one of those you're going to talk about, and I'm going to talk about each of them differently. So this is some work I did actually with Ken Norris in the National Ecosystem Assessment, where we tried to sort out this issue about biodiversity and ecosystem services. That it can be a regulator of ecosystem processes, it can be a service in itself, you can have biodiversity that's a service, and biodiversity can be a benefit, a good or a benefit, something you just want to sustain. But the really important thing to recognise is it's different components of biodiversity in each of those places. In the ecosystem process underpinning side, it's very often microorganisms or primary producers, plants, fungi and so on, whereas when you come over into the benefit side, it's the large charismatic vertebrates, maybe the rare species, maybe endemic characteristic communities of various kinds. So it's not the same. You have to actually think about which the biodiversity is that's underpinning, because there isn't a conservation programme for microbes. but we need to have the right microbial community in order to achieve decomposition, nutrient cycling, and so on. So the biodiversity is also important because the most prevailing story about biodiversity is that we're losing it. So one of the strong arguments behind ecosystem services is we need to preserve the biodiversity that underpins ecosystem services. So this biodiversity loss is also quite complicated to demonstrate. These are three different ways of measuring biodiversity loss. This is the decline of local species richness from the PREDICT model between 1500 and the year 2000. This is the hockey stick model for biodiversity, just like the climate change model. It shows this big tip down in local species richness after about 1850s, latter half of the 19th century, coinciding with the Industrial Revolution pretty much. This is a slide of loss of abundance of biodiversity. So it's nothing to do with diversity per se, it's what's the average number of vertebrate species worldwide since 1970. So this is telling you there's been a 58% decline in the average abundance of vertebrate species. So that's just how many there are out there, what's the biomass in the environment. And then this is a series of plots showing progress towards extinction rates. So the lines are sloping down as more species within each of these groups move closer and closer to extinction. That's coming from the Red List Index. So all these are measuring different dimensions of biodiversity. Species richness is measuring variability, the Living Planet is measuring abundance, and the Red List Index is measuring extinction rates. And they all show slightly different curves and figures for how much has been lost, but they're all pointing downwards. And that is a serious worry. Which one of those you worry about, actually, which one you worry about most depends on what it is you're concerned about with biodiversity. So the main reason that ecosystem service or ecosystem function people are worried about loss of biodiversity is because we know from a series of very well run and well established experiments and field studies over the past 20 years or so that as you lose biological diversity, you also see a degradation in ecosystem function. So this is a sort of composite figure from many of these studies showing that decline from a highly diverse system down to a monoculture as you deplete biodiversity. Now, of course, there's lots of variability about the shape of that curve. It's definitely non-linear, it's got a tipping point. As a monoculture, down here where there's only one species, you may actually have a system that is more productive or more highly functioning than any system that has multiple species in it. So that's kind of the basis for agriculture. The most productive species performs best in monoculture. But on average, as you move species around into different levels of species diversity, you lose function. So that's why we ought to be worried about this loss of diversity. There is a bit of a problem about this analysis, though, at the scales at which many of us are thinking about biodiversity loss. So if you think about, this is a very broad cartoon-type diagram going from years through decades to centuries on the y-axis, and from local landscape to global scale on the x-axis. Now those biodiversity ecosystem function experiments are all down here. They're all at best field scale. You simply can't do manipulative experiments at anything larger than field scale, and most of them are lab-based, microcosm or mesocosm based studies. And most of the really good evidence about where human impacts reducing biodiversity are at a very large scale. This is where the species extinctions, the Living Planet Index and so on is reporting, is right up here, where anthropogenic drivers are causing declines in species. And there is a knowledge gap in the middle, at this scale at which policy is actually implemented, or designed and implemented, the landscape scale over years to decades, where we really worry about ecosystem functioning and services, I don't think we know how to scale up these experiments or how to scale down those impacts at that level. And in this paper, there's a series of recommendations about how to actually fill that gap. What is the combination of observational, experimental and modelling studies that would allow that gap to be filled with better science-based knowledge? Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, one of the important features of the people and nature framing is about resilience. We're preserving nature in part because it helps with adaptability and resilience in a changing world. And we know the world is changing rather quickly. There are new climates, there's habitat change, there are new food systems, there are new pathogens, pests spreading across the landscape all the time. So how do we understand biodiversity and ecosystem resilience? So this comes from a paper that Tom Oliver and colleagues did actually as part of the BEST project a couple of years ago, which I think is really helpful. Firstly, in defining resilience as being, it's just the ability of a system to stay above some required level of function. So this function phi on the y-axis is a required level, and the system gets buffered by, or battered by various perturbations, which may be large or small, and it there collapses. And then if it's got rather low resistance, it falls below that line. And you can see these two different features of resilience about resistance, how well it's buffered. It buffers itself from dropping below that required level, and recovery, if it does drop below, how well it can recover, how quickly it can emerge. But basically a resilient system is one that spends less time below that line, either because it never goes there or because when it gets there it can bounce back. And there's a set of things that we know from science and from ecology about how to improve both resistance and recovery at various levels, from species through communities through to ecosystems. So things like finding species that are less sensitive, species that have got high growth rates, high phenotypic plasticity. At the community level, it's the combination of species and particularly whether they're correlated in their response to threats, whether there's functional redundancy between them, and some features of the network itself, particularly how modular the network is. Is it too connected? Is it not connected? And then a set of things at landscape scale about environmental heterogeneity, functional connectivity, and so on. So we know how to enhance resilience using species and ecosystems. And I think we could build a lot more on just this basic, rather simple set of rules that provide resilience against future threats. Now, another way in which we value nature is about resilience for people. There I was talking about resilience of the ecosystem itself. Now I'm going to just talk for a few minutes about resilience of human societies. And I'm going to do this in the context of one of these benefits here, which is about hazard protection. And just show you some work that we did a few years ago now, looking at the role of ecosystems in buffering people from extreme weather. So this was a Royal Society science policy report that we did in 2014, I think. And it actually is becoming more and more relevant all the time because it made this observation that extreme weather is already having impacts on society. We're already seeing extreme winds, extreme rainfall, extreme heat waves, and we already have a resilience deficit. Human societies are not geared to deal with this. You only have to look at what happened in Houston just a few months ago. And the report looked at extreme weather causing coastal flooding, river flooding, droughts and heat waves. It looks at how those might change in the future, so this is the emerging threats and new environments, and how to build resilience, including nature-based resilience. And this applies in the UK. We know we've had river flooding in the UK. This is the Dawlish system. But of course it occurs internationally. And there's a rather poignant fact that when it's reported internationally, it can be in GDP terms when it's destroying infrastructure in Houston or New York, or measured in terms of human lives when it's in India, Southeast Asia and so on. But there's much evidence that these kinds of extreme weather events will increase in future. And they increase in impact for two reasons. Firstly, because climate change is likely to cause more extreme weather, but also because there are more people who are exposed to that extreme weather. And the projections are that as populations grow, many people move into these areas that are particularly vulnerable, to coastal areas, to floodplains in delta areas, coastal zones, etc. And even the urban centres, which are very vulnerable to heat waves. So this came out of that report looking at the multiplying factors over the next 100 years that are estimated for heat waves, floods and droughts, for climate-caused increases, population-caused increases, and then the two factored together, the total. So you expect there to be 12 times as many people impacted by heat waves, 4.5 times as many impacted by floods, 3 times as many by droughts, as at the end of the last century compared to the end of the next century. So this report compared in a sort of expert-based way 3 kinds of interventions: engineered, ecosystem-based, or these hybrid interventions where you engineer systems to help them use nature's own capacity. So this is the Thames Barrier, it's engineered. This is a natural floodplain, it's natural, and this is one of these engineered dune systems actually in New York in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. And the assessment looked at various kind of interventions that you could put in one of those 3 categories, and what their effectiveness is, i.e. how well they worked, versus how much they cost, how affordable they were. So this x-axis, the affordability one, is plotted the wrong way around, so the right-hand side is cheap, and the left-hand side is expensive. The effectiveness, the top works and the bottom doesn't. So what you'd really want to see is interventions up here, top right-hand side. They're effective and they're cheap, but of course life isn't like that. The most expensive ones work best, which are some of these engineered ones, but many of the nature-based and even the hybrid ones do pretty well. This is the river flooding interventions. So the hybrid ones here are sustainable urban drainage systems and changes to agricultural land management and catchment-based scales. And you can see that number 1 there is re-establishment of floodplains. So this work on looking at the effectiveness of nature-based interventions was done over all these extreme weather events. And this is the blogogram that results. This is a highlight of my scientific career, this slide. I'm very proud of the colouring in. But what it shows you generally is, the effectiveness is mostly higher for engineered ones than ecosystem-based. The hybrid ones can do very well. But there was an important side issue around this, which is the engineered ones, when they fail, and there is plenty of examples of them failing, they fail catastrophically with huge impacts. Whereas ecosystem-based ones, as they may fail, but they fail slowly, and people can intervene as they fail to mitigate the impact. The engineered interventions are usually someone else's property and responsibility, whereas ecosystem-based ones are cared for by people because they derive other kinds of benefits from them. And we looked at that in a bit more detail. We looked at how each of these kinds of interventions, the ecosystem-based ones in green, the engineered ones in grey, and the hybrid ones in orange, how well they deliver co-benefits. So here's access to food, access to livelihoods, climate change and mitigation, protection against multiple hazards, biodiversity conservation, access to water. And you can see that the nature-based ones, the ecosystem-based, or the hybrid ones, generally are positive for other kinds of benefits, whereas the engineered ones are not. And so there are many other benefits from these nature-based solutions. And the conclusion was that in the face of these extreme events, you should look at a portfolio of measures, not just the engineered ones, but very importantly, consider the co-benefits, and particularly the fact that some ecosystem-based solutions are relatively cheap. They are sustainable, they have local engagement and buy-in, and they have many co-benefits. So if we go back to this figure, it would be that you don't just think about one of those benefits at a time and try to manage an ecosystem to provide that. You wouldn't just think about flood control. You should also think about food and energy, clean water, nature conservation, and so on. These multiple benefits turns out to be a very important feature of nature-based interventions. And that brings me to my last point, which is to think a bit more about investing in nature. And so this is to turn the issue around a bit and say, not how do we show that nature delivers net benefits to us, but were we able to invest in whole new nature recreation, restoration, or recovery programs? What are the things that would show really good return on investment? Where might we invest at large scale in nature recovery that could deliver these benefits, such as for timber, food, water quality, flood regulation, soil carbon, etc.? And so this is a little analysis that was done when Rosie and I were on the Natural Capital Committee. It was supported by many people. It was quite a substantial piece of work at the time that looked at where the government might invest substantial sums in investing in new nature restoration and recovery projects. And this was this is in the Natural Capital Committee's report in 2015. These are the ones where there was really good evidence that investment would have a good return on investment. So woodland planting, at least 250,000 additional hectares, would generate net benefits in excess of £500 million a year. So this is putting a monetary value on it. Upland peatland restoration has good return in terms of water quality, recreation, wildlife values. Wetland recreation, protecting cities, giving a sustainable hydrology, but also improving agricultural land. So a set of cases where there was good evidence that the money put into the nature recovery would show good return. And then there was a set where more evidence was required. It looked tantalisingly as though it would work well, but it wasn't entirely clear. So the urban green space, which I know is a focus for this programme, improving air quality, not because it's not definitely a good thing to do, but it's just not quite clear where the ecosystem investment is that has a big impact on air quality. Improving the environmental performance of farming and catchment scale management. And one of the things that we looked at then was, well, how would these investments in natural capital stack up against investments in built capital? So this is government thinks about this a lot when you're building huge new infrastructure, road systems, railway systems, big flood defences and so on. What's the benefit to cost ratio in terms of the amount it costs versus the economic benefits of delivering it? And this slide just summarises those benefit to cost ratios for a set of built assets, things that government regularly invest in, road schemes, rail schemes, active travel, flood defences. Broadband is the winner, actually. That turns out to be the best thing to spend your money on. But here are these ecosystem-based investments: woodland planting, catchment restoration, salt marsh restoration, and inland wetland restoration. You can see they look perfectly respectable. They don't quite meet the broadband level of return on investment, but they're perfectly respectable, and actually they beat railway investments, which are a thing of under great favour at the moment. So you can make a macroeconomic case for investing in nature. And I think that's a good way to think about valuing nature at this scale, rather than at the level of individual services and individual ecosystems, for all the reasons I've talked about, that it's at these larger scales where there are multiple benefits that the big return on investment is really going to be found. So I'll just conclude with a few points. I think it is important to acknowledge the multiple framings for nature conservation, that there are very different views about what the priorities are here. That we need to think about the needs and demands from society and not just the potential supply from ecosystems. Ecosystem services arose out of natural sciences, and sometimes it's too easy for us to think about the supply side rather than the demand side. Species and habitat restoration is and should be an end in itself. It has equal value, and in many ways more value. It's more irreplaceable than many of the ecosystem service benefits that are more traditionally given high monetary valuations. And that species and habitat restoration can support ecosystem services and functions, and certainly underpins resilience and adaptability. And that is a key area of research. I pointed out this research gap, especially to scale up from small-scale experimental studies to understand more about that system. I tried to emphasize the importance of thinking about multiple benefits, and investing in stocks may be better than just an over-focus on the services. And I guess the take-home message is, don't lose nature by not thinking about it or not giving it enough priority, because it's incredibly hard to restore once it's lost. And I'll end with my favourite quote from Theodore Roosevelt, who actually said all this getting on for more than 100 years ago. So he combines in this quote, which is on the foyer in the American Museum of Natural History in New York, he combines the kind of aesthetic view of nature with this functional and public responsibility one. So he says, "There is a delight in the hardy life of the open. There are no words that can tell the hidden spirit of the wilderness, that can reveal its mystery, its melancholy, and its charm." It's all really nice. "The nation behaves well if it treats natural resources as assets, which it must turn over to the next generation increased and not impaired in value. Conservation means development as much as it does protection." I'll finish there. Thank you.